Welcome to the deep dive. So you hear those first few notes of a synth riff,
Oh, yeah.
and your mind immediately goes to, what, a skinny tie? A really gravity-defying haircut?
You're thinking of new wave.
You're thinking of new wave. And look, we all love that 80s nostalgia trip.
Of course.
But that glossy surface, it hides a story that's so much more complex.
Exactly. I mean, new wave was much more than just a soundtrack for a decade. Our mission today, looking at the source material, is to really understand that this movement was the crucial cultural bridge between, the fury of punk
Right.
and the high-tech mediated world that was coming in the 1980s.
So we're not just talking about another music genre. The core argument in the research is that new wave was more of a cultural label.
Yes, a label that somehow defined entire period sensibility.
So for you, the listener, the goal here is to cut past that superficial image and really grasp the intellectual, artistic, and, well, often politically anxious core of this whole era.
Think of it this way. The artists who were creating new wave, they were trying to figure out how to be rebellious and experimental in a world that had just suddenly become very technological.
Then very cynical.
And very cynical.
Yeah.
They basically traded the safety pin and the 3 chords of punk for the sleek, cold precision of the synthesizer.
That is a perfect way to put it. So let's unpack that. Let's start right where all that energy began, in the aftermath of punk rock's brilliant but really brief flame.
Well, the initial punk movement in '76, it was absolutely necessary. It was simple, fast, fiercely anti-establishment.
Gut reaction.
A total gut reaction to the bloated arena rock of the time. It worked because it was so simple and raw.
But that same intensity, the very thing that made punk so revolutionary, it also kind of limited its lifespan, didn't it?
It had to. I mean, by its very nature, punk rejected complexity.
And great artists, especially the ones trying to start a revolution, they crave new forms of expression.
And of course, once something that big in counterculture hits the charts, the commercialization clock starts ticking. The shock value just wears off.
So the question for them was, how do you keep the spirit of punk, that experimental, anti-status quo energy, without just repeating the same old formula?
You can't just keep playing 3 power chords and screaming.
But needed new tools.
Precisely. And they chose to dramatically expand their musical vocabulary.
Right.
So new wave became this catch-all term for that whole intellectual and sonic evolution.
So not a rigid genre with strict rules.
No, not at all. It was an artistic movement. It brought in art rock sophistication, but also this aggressive electronic expansion. It took punk's raw frame and just built something way more complex and nuanced on top of it.
And what's so fascinating to me is the duality within that term. When we say new wave, we're talking about two, radically different sonic goals that were happening at the same time.
That duality is the key to the whole era. On one side, you had this dark, deep, and really experimental post-punk sound. These were the artists exploring, urban grime, existential dread, alienation. Think of bands like Joy Division.
Who then became New Order after the tragedy of Ian Curtis.
Exactly. Or a band like The Cure.
That sound is pure intellectual withdrawal. It's that late-night anxiety of a city living under a constant shadow. It's bleak. It's introspective.
Absolutely. But then, on the complete opposite end of that spectrum, you had the artists who just grabbed the new technology for maximum commercial impact.
The glossy, flashy, super catchy pop.
This is the side most people remember from MTV. Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, ABC. They kept the style, they kept the edge, but they were aiming straight for the dance floor and the charts.
So both groups were rejecting the rock that came before them, but one used complexity to find darkness, and the other used it to create this dazzling, high-fidelity pop. It's like an ideological battle fought with instruments.
And both of them shared that same punk DNA, that desire for something new. But their destinations were miles apart. And this ability to hold such extremes is exactly why new wave works so well as a broad cultural label.
And the mechanism that allowed for that huge expansion, from angry, simple thrash to the sleek, emotional pop, that was a huge shift in instrumentation. This is where technology really takes over.
Oh, yeah. The analog synthesizer and the drum machine weren't just new instruments. They represented a philosophical break.
They created that cold, mechanical, and often purposefully impersonal sound that just defines the era.
And the synth also democratized sound, didn't it?
Totally. Suddenly, a small band, not a lot of resources. They could create sounds that used to need a whole orchestra or tons of expensive studio time. Two people could sound like an army.
Acts like Gary Newman and Ultravox were true pioneers in this.
Yeah.
Their music didn't just use technology. Their music sounded like technology.
It was the future arriving, sometimes thrilling, sometimes a bit terrifyingly mechanical.
Right. And the drum machine, with its perfect, unvarying rhythm, it was such a sharp contrast to the human, often sloppy drumming of classic rock. It just reinforced that sense of cold urbanity.
That mechanical sound was the perfect backdrop for the lyrical themes that were bubbling up, all that Cold War anxiety.
For sure. But New Wave wasn't just about electronics. It was the ultimate fusion movement. It totally broke rock's traditional boundaries by just fearlessly looking outward.
This cross-pollination just shows that artists were looking way beyond the narrow history of rock and roll. They were engaging with global street music, with dance culture.
And they weren't just borrowing bits and pieces. They were integrating these sounds.
You see a band like Talking Heads, David Byrne grabbing these really complex funk rhythms and then injecting them with this intellectual kind of angular delivery.
They didn't sound like Parliament, but they were definitely using that rhythmic engine.
Or you have the Police taking the serious, heavy syncopation of reggae grooves and turning them into these massive pop hits.
They showed that you could polish these global sounds and put them in a rock framework without losing all the edge.
And then you have acts like Blondie, who were just fearless. They adopted a full-on disco dance sensibility. Their song Heart of Glass.
That's not a rock song with disco bits. It's pure electropop and disco. It showed a total willingness to just embrace commercial dance music.
And this adventurous spirit wasn't just for the superstars, was it?
No, it was everywhere. From the charts down to the underground clubs. You see it in regionally successful bands like Furniture, who are around for over a decade, or even in these aggressive theatrical post-punk acts like the Bollock Brothers. This wasn't just a trend, it was a fundamental shift in how music was being made.
So you combine that new mechanical sound with the social environment of the late 70s, early 80s, the Cold War tensions, fear of social decay, and you get these intensely satirical and anxious lyrics.
Absolutely. The lyrical content was just overwhelmingly focused on urban alienation, that gnawing anxiety of global conflict,
Right.
and this deep, often hilarious satire of technological society and conformity.
And nobody captured that satirical spirit better than Devo.
Their entire aesthetic, the jumpsuits, the jerky movements, it was all an ironic performance. It was social criticism acted out on stage.
Right. Their album New Traditionalists is the perfect example of that critique. They were commenting on societal regression.
The idea that despite all our advanced technology, we were becoming less evolved, more conformist. They were literally using the sound of the future, the synthesizer, to warn us about the future.
Which is fascinating, because the cold, perfect precision of the synth and the drum machine, the medium, was perfectly suited to deliver their message of social breakdown and sterility.
The medium and the message were completely aligned.
Irony, style, and visuals. If the 70s were mainly about sound and maybe album art, the 80s were just completely dominated by image.
And New Wave was perfectly poised to capitalize on that shift, especially when MTV arrived in 1981.
The launch of MTV was a tectonic event. I mean, it instantly established New Wave as a visual and sound fusion genre. A band couldn't just release a song anymore.
No, you had to release a stylized cinematic video.
Yeah.
You were selling a complete aesthetic package.
Absolutely. Bands like Duran Duran with their exotic locations and huge production values,
There.
or A Flock of Seagulls.
Their hair became as iconic as their music.
Exactly. They understood immediately that the visual was inseparable from the sonic. They were marketing the early 80s dream.
And that aesthetic, it wasn't unified. It was visually fractured, carrying on that punk DIY spirit through these wildly contrasting fashions.
Let's talk about that fashion duality.
Well, on one hand, you had neo-romanticism. This was pure theatrical escapism, a dramatic rejection of drab reality.
Ornate androgynous looks, silk shirts, heavy eyeliner for everyone.
Vivid colors, and a real commitment to theatrical flair. It was about creating a fantasy persona.
But then contrasting that completely, you had the synth-pop look.
Totally different. It was monochrome, streamlined, futuristic, often had angular shapes, minimal, sometimes military-inspired lines. It was all about projecting a sense of sleek, cold urbanity.
Less romance, more dystopian efficiency.
Right. But both styles were a radical break from the denim and long hair of the generation before.
And the connection wasn't just to street fashion. This movement had serious intellectual credibility because the art world was deeply involved.
Look at Talking Heads again. David Byrne, who was art school educated, wasn't just listening to funk records. He was drawing direct influence from conceptual and minimal art movements in New York.
So their music was designed to be intellectually engaged.
And structurally rigorous. And in the UK, the visual language was deeply tied to pop art history and the revolutionary fashion of figures like Vivienne Westwood.
Who started in punk and has evolved right into the new romantic world.
Which brings up the critical question. Why did this specific explosion of intellectual, technological, and visual culture happen across multiple continents all at the same time? What was the geopolitical fuel driving it?
The context is everything, and it was so different depending on where you were. Let's start with the UK.
The UK was the birthplace of punk, but by the late 70s, it was just mired in economic crisis. High unemployment under the new Thatcher government. This created a profound sense of closure without a future for young people.
And that despair translates directly into the sound of those darker post-punk bands.
Absolutely. The bleakness of Manchester, the anxiety of London's unemployment that fueled the introspection and detachment you hear in bands like The Cure or Joy Division. Music was the only outlet for a generation that felt abandoned.
Now contrast that with the US, specifically in New York.
Here, new wave spread as this intellectual, experimental music linked directly to the downtown art scene. It wasn't fueled by economic despair so much as by intellectual freedom.
Incubated in those legendary chaotic clubs like CBGB and the Mud Club.
Exactly. It was the sound of artists moving from the raw energy of early New York punk to something more sophisticated and performative.
So in the US, intellectual energy from the art world. In the UK, it's despair and economic anxiety. And then there's the third major hub, Japan.
Japan gives us a completely different backdrop. You have the tail end of this period of high economic growth and rapid technological progress.
So these artists weren't responding to collapse, they were responding to hyperspeed innovation.
Which led to the emergence of acts like Yellow Magic Orchestra YMO and Plastics. They became known internationally as techno-new wave.
And they celebrated and sometimes satirized technology from a highly advanced, non-Western point of view, often with a cleaner, sharper electronic sound.
So new wave really was a global response to shared technological advancement and differing economic anxieties. That geopolitical context is what lifts it so far beyond just being 80s music. It was a reflection of a generation's consciousness worldwide.
But as with all revolutionary movements, the mainstream eventually catches up and the edge gets dull. It seems inevitable that a sound like that would eventually get sanitized. How quickly did that happen?
By the mid-1980s, the experimentation had largely been absorbed. The sources point out that new wave became increasingly commercialized, heavily standardized.
Tied directly to that safe, shiny MTV imagery.
Right, the unique, challenging edge softened as the sound just became the default setting for pop music production.
But the core spirit, that hunger for experimentation and fusion, it didn't just disappear. And that's the enduring so what of this deep dive. Its legacy is in everything that came after it.
The experimental ethos was carried forward immediately. You see its direct inheritance in the foundational alternative rock bands.
Like REM and the Smiths.
Their intellectual literary songwriting style came directly from the post-punk side of new wave. It proved that intelligence could coexist with guitar-driven rock.
And of course, the technological inheritance was massive. It shaped all of modern electronic music.
The synth-pop and electropop evolution, starting with bands like Depeche Mode, essentially standardized electronic music structures. That DNA leads directly to modern acts today, like CHVR CHES or the 1975 or Grimes. The sound design they pioneered is now just the bedrock of global pop.
And we can't forget that culture is cyclical. The post-punk revival in the early 2000s.
Oh yeah, Interpol, Franz Ferdinand, The Strokes.
They proved that this specific sound, the angular guitars, the smart lyrics, the synth hooks, is perpetually relevant. Because the anxieties it was addressing, they never really go away.
And that's the final definition, what we want you to take away from this. New wave was a major historical turning point because it transcended those rigid genre walls.
It didn't just produce songs.
It elevated music into a total cultural movement. It combined music, fashion, high art, and social critique. It really was this synthetic art of the era.
The perfect, multifaceted mirror reflecting the anxiety and the technological excitement of a world right on the cusp of the digital age.
That's right. The complexity and duality of new wave were dictated by those profound global economic and technological shifts happening all at once in these different cities. It was a sophisticated reaction to a sophisticated moment in history.
And the plot that still resonates so much for me is that biting element of irony and satire, particularly how bands like Devo use the new technology, the synth, the drum machine, to critique the very society that produced them.
Which leads us to our final thought, something for you to chew on. If New Wave was the defining movement that satirized Cold War anxiety and that first big wave of technological
Yeah,
society.
synths and early computing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How is today's music responding to the anxieties and the technological dominance of the 21st century? Are we seeing that same level of biting satire against AI and social media, or are we maybe just embracing the machine completely?